Apart from the fishman known as Salvatore Moreau, there was one other lord who had it pretty horrible, probably more so concerning their pre-cadou life than their post-cadou life. Actually, a case could be made that their post-cadou infection life was probably better than what came before. You see, life in general was pretty lame for the four lords, but varied in amount of lameness. For Dimitrescu, which I swear to God, every time I say that name, somebody's like, you pronounced it wrong. A Romanian told me that's the way you pronounce it, I don't know. Anyways, she was living in a literal castle with servants that she would regularly drink their blood, so life was pretty sweet, as really she had whatever she wanted. For Heisenberg, he was content to stay in his factory and continue building his own personal army to overthrow Miranda, which was then thwarted by Ethan, which actually would have been a pretty cool character arc for him, but oh well. Then there was Salvatore Moreau, whose family had a clinic in the small mountain village, or at least on the outskirts of it, that would ultimately go on to violate the Hippocratic Oath, which his fate was sealed, being a fish monster snacking on fishermen. But the last lord, in my personal opinion, likely had it worse than the others. Donna Beneviento was one of the four lords tasked with overseeing the village as a whole, but originally were one of the four most influential families in the area to boot. Shortly after their inauguration in the land of parasites, all their bodies would be changed to varying degrees, but arguably Donna had the least aggressive changes brought on by the parasite, well, unless you count Heisenberg. However, even with that being the case, her ability to control what people would see and hear could easily rank her up there in terms of ability, likely just below Heisenberg, but still definitely more powerful than Dimitrescu or Moreau in terms of ability to absolutely body anyone that came around. So in today's episode, we will talk about the lore morphology of Donna Beneviento, the last of the four lords, and how she was able to make people hallucinate to the point that they didn't even know what was on their body concerning force multipliers. I mean, hey, you could even argue that the entire thing didn't happen, and really, Ethan just hallucinated all of it. So I believe the first place that we should start is her background before moving on to the actual neurology behind what's happening with her powers and how she could absolutely make you hallucinate Shrek is love, Shrek is life if she truly wanted to. Donna's entire life basically sucked. Thanks for watching. And how many times am I gonna use that joke? I don't know. Now, the village already had literal folklore around the four lords before they were even changed by the cadou parasite, and basically Mother Miranda showed up and made everyone's life way worse. Because if Mama ain't happy, nobody is happy. Which reminds me, I mean, you guys probably know, but I should do a video on her to discuss why she wasn't happy, or just really go on to watch the other four lords videos because it's pretty much discussed extensively. Anyhow, Donna Beneviento was born during sometime around the 20th century, much like the other four lords. It would appear likely that it was during the early 20th century, as everyone in this area concerning the four lords too were impacted by the Great War in one way or another. Her family elected to have a house built near a giant waterfall on the outskirts of town, utilizing their lavish account, which honestly, I mean, man, if the area wasn't so creepy from the drop, that would be an awesome location. Just better hope your roof never leaks. Also, what do you do if the waterfall actually swells from like heavy rains? Who knows? Moving on, during this point, as stated, the village began to form ideas about where the Benevientos came from, as they didn't really care too much for the other three lords either, accusing her and her family of descending from the Berengario, which was an ancient mutant in folklore, which was said to have settled the area. The village seemed to think that the other three lords were also direct descendants of these monsters as well. But there does seem to be some validity linking all four lords in this way, as the Berengarios were at the top. Then over time, the descendants would move out to different areas to become the four lords, with Mother Miranda basically destroying the feudal rule in the area, placing her at the top and the four lords underneath her. Well, from here, things got even more terrible. As Beneviento grew up, her parents would ultimately go on to unalive themselves, which, as you might guess, would negatively impact the mental well-being of a child. This resulted in likely abandonment issues, which in turn would go on to create a massive amount of anxiety within Donna. Due to this being the reality and it happening to her at such a young age, this would affect her interpersonal skills, meaning that she would prefer the isolation of her home and her craft. Much like her father, Donna would go on to also create some of the worst dolls I have ever seen. I mean, take Angie for instance, the talking piece doll that she uses as her liaison that was created by her father. This is also likely why she would gravitate towards specifically this doll, as it's her last connection apart from the house itself to her parents. Man, that is depressing. As time continued, Donna would remain in this isolated position away from the others in the village below, making dolls to replace her family that had been lost. Of course, the irony being that Beneviento means welcome according to Google Translate, and she would really not be all that very welcoming. Now that I have stated that, someone is going to say that is not what that means, which will obviously kick off a whole bunch of other discussions about how I suck at pronunciations. Welcome to the channel. So, Donna would stay separated from virtually everyone for much of her adult life, but there appears to be one situation which may make her life even more terrible than it already was. So we are treading outside of the lore for a moment and into speculation, but there is a grave labeled Claudia Beneviento, where you can get the Berengario chalice linking the Beneviento family to the Berengario. But that said, the girl in the grave was born in 1987 and expired in 1996, making her 9 years old. Quick moths. It's been said that it could have been explain her sister, but I doubt that here. Mainly because the case is made that her parents were around during the Great War due to the dissolving of the feudal system afterwards and their subsequent hold on the area. Then Donna was born sometimes afterwards. Considering the year Claudia was born, this would definitely put Donna at a bit older and her parents already likely gone because, again, they took themselves out when she was a child, but this still makes Donna at childbearing age. Now, the thing about being older and having children is issues can arise, but this does confirm that Donna wasn't completely separated from society, just mostly separated. However, after the child got to the age of 9, somehow she would go on to meet her end. It's not specified how, but after Donna had pretty much lost everything, as the father isn't mentioned either, although the gardener was out there somewhere, the only person she really talked to was actually the gardener. This led her to completely section herself off, apart from meeting up with the other 4 lords later on. Eventually, after all these horrendous turn of events happened, Mother Miranda would begin her investigation into the cadou parasite in an effort to bring her daughter back from the grave. Donna would have the cadou implanted in her, and much like the other 4 lords, would have a partial acceptance of this parasite, but unlike Moreau and Dimitrescu, she would not become as mutated as them, depending on your definition of mutation when it comes to Dimitrescu. I mean, really, she was kind of just tall. After this implantation, she would become one of the 4 lords and become the adopted daughter of Mother Miranda. Although like the other 4 lords, she was considered to be a failure as she was mentally ill and undeveloped, according to Miranda. So this may have been the actually only good thing that happened in the last century for her, but like all the other good things, this too would come to an end eventually. Once Ethan got involved, everything would further go to crap to the point that she would shuffle off her quasi-immortal coil. With Ethan's daughter taken and then subsequently cut into a bunch of different parts and placed into jars, which, I mean, it seems like it just would have been easier to keep the child together, although I suppose there is way less noise this way, Ethan would begin taking down the other 4 lords to reclaim his kid. Heading up to the Beneviento homestead, he would unknowingly walk into pollen put off by the numerous flowers in the area, which were altered by the mold. This mutated pollen would enter the nasal passages where it would diffuse into the membrane and then move into the brain itself of Ethan. Once this happened, Donna would have control over what he would see and hear. For Ethan, he immediately began hallucinating about Mia, as she had just real downer moments about everyone leaving her, which was probably brought on, honestly, by Donna, because really everybody does leave her. Ethan would then go on to find the entrance to the Beneviento land, but placing a picture of him and his family in the mail slot, this would gain him access. Upon getting to the house, this is where the real horrifying crap is. Dolls everywhere, it's just a literal nightmare. But descending into the basement of the home, he would continue to hallucinate as he found a human-sized doll on the table, which would hold different pieces to solve a puzzle to escape, but not before being told by Donna that he should stay forever. Though before he could actually get to the flask and get out of there, the lights would be cut off. Angie would talk to him and he would be relieved of his force multipliers, or so he thought. Really, it's likely just a hallucination that he's having, but it's also entirely possible, since we learn later Donna can take the visage of Angie, that she was in the room with him and then relieved him of his force multipliers. Once here, it just gets way worse. A giant fetus shows up, which will straight up just eat you whole, which actually, side tangent for a second. Now, I think we all know the sound of a baby crying is agitating to us as a species, but for women, typically when they hear a baby crying, and I say typically because it's never the same across the board, due to brain scans that have been done, there's actually a difference between men and women's brains. Women will typically respond with a more attentive measure, but for men, this can result in agitation, which there's likely a reason for this. A saber-tooth enters the cave. You hear a baby crying. Women go to check on the baby, men react in aggression, hair standing up, again, agitation, the works. Seems to me like it was actually a pretty good adaptation. So depending on your sex and the individual that you are, when you heard this giant fetus thing crying, you may have actually had a different response to it. Also interestingly, if you didn't know, in movies when the stinger noise plays, that's the same frequency as a baby crying, which activates your almonds as well as makes you feel on edge. So now you know how you're literally being manipulated via your parental instincts by movie companies. So this fetus is just god-awful, hair standing up the entire time I heard it for the first time, which, considering this is like a mini boss, you know what, we're gonna go ahead and cover just its morphology real quick, because seeing as Donna is virtually just a human, we will simply refer to it as the baby, which, sweet god. Starting with the feet, this creature walks in a reverse method, almost like its legs are likened to that of a grasshopper. The legs are set backwards on the body as it appears to have been twisted full 180 degrees, and considering how the spine moves off when approaching the abdomen area, this appears to be exactly what happened. One of the feet is turned to the side while the other is fully on the ground. The skin is also blotched blotchy and red. On the lower portion appears to be a tail dragging along the ground that seems obviously to be vestigial. Moving up to the abdomen, the pelvis itself is what's completely turned around, with the abdomen still towards the ground. There's not much to be seen here though, apart from the rounded distended stomach. Moving up to the chest, again, no muscle mass can be seen. I mean, it is a baby, but the skin is extremely thick and inflamed in several areas. On the back, we see the spine isn't looking so hot, with it going off to one side, down the back as mentioned previously. The shoulder blades are not symmetrical either, and the spine appears to definitely have a fair amount of scoliosis. Moving up to the head, well, that's only a face a mother could love. I mean, it's sort of like the baby's cranium is there, with all the basic morphological characteristics that we would expect, except for one glaring change, the giant mouth. This mouth descends all the way down to the neck, basically what appears to be the top of the sternum, and considering the size of the fetus monster already, this means that it can fit an entire adult human in it, which it does. If you're caught by this thing, it'll basically just grab you with its front hands and pull you in legs first to a grisly fate, literally caused by your own hallucinations. But once escaping that thing, you move back upstairs where Donna confronts you via Angie once more, saying that she doesn't want you to go, which I mean, I get that she wants to take you out, but considering everything else is left on it, this is actually really depressing. She will threaten you with her friends as you run around with a pair of scissors, and you can actually find a little girl's room upstairs that I believe denotes Claudia is actually Donna's daughter. After finding Angie 3 times and using the old American Psycho method on her, your hallucinations will cease suddenly, as the whole time you're actually just going ham on Donna. We get a quick glimpse of her before she calcifies out, spelling the end of this lore. So getting a look at Donna, likely prior to her infection with the cadou, she was a normal looking person, meaning that she could have definitely hooked up with someone to have a child, but after the fact, this would have likely made her more of a recluse, as the entire right half of her face had turned into a tumorous mass brought on by the mold and cadou infection process. But this cadou would have endowed her with many capabilities that she would use to screw with people's heads. The first is that Donna was capable of splitting up the cadou from her own body and placing them within the dolls around her. So basically, when you see these dolls freaking out, this is not just a part of the hallucination, but this is actually happening. So those things really will stab you. In order to avert some of her loneliness, she would do this to replace her family in consistent loss. Upon her expiration, these cadou would also expire, as they were linked to the same cadou that just got dropped. But I know why we're all really here. It's time to get to the neurology of this pollen, so let me set up the pathway of it so we can get a clear understanding of what is happening to a person on a neurological level concerning this infection process. Cadou work as an intermediary between the mold and the person. This was designed this way so that Mother Miranda could force her daughter's consciousness, which was stored within the megamycete, into another person through the ritual, as we all know, but the lords were these failed experiments. That said, the cadou exercised control in both ways. In one way, the forced consciousness being placed on others, and the other way, the person is able to influence the mold to bend it to their will. Or that's what we were led to believe, because really, they could just be all pawns and controlled, because I really don't see why they would willingly just do these things under Miranda's orders unless their brains are just absolutely being washed by mold. But with Donna controlling the mold that then influenced the flowers, the mold pollen hybrid would drift through the area before entering the higher regions of the nasal passages, where just like a brain-eating amoeba, it would enter the brain by finding nerve cells, which resulted in your brain now having mold spores move through, having basically completely bypassed the natural defenses like the mucus that are set up to defend the brain. Once inside the brain, it would be alarmingly easier than you might imagine to induce hallucinations. Now, affecting specifically what you see is a little more difficult, but heading to the temporal lobe of the brain associated with hearing, this would be stimulated in order to begin the auditory hallucinations. However, this would not be enough, as we would need another area of the brain to be activated as well, actually have these hallucinations mean something. By stimulating the hippocampus in conjunction with the rest of the temporal lobe, this would add memories into the mix to give context to these auditory hallucinations. The hippocampus is actually located within the temporal lobe, and this is where memories are formed and indexed for later access. You can see how stimulating this entire lobe to a degree would make it rather simple for Ethan to start hearing things. Then, moving further back into the brain, the opposite of stimulation would be taking place, which is pretty interesting. You wouldn't be faulted to think that visual hallucinations brought on by the mold would just have your brain firing like crazy concerning the neurons. But actually, when people are hallucinating visually, there is less communication between the neurons, as well as the firing patterns do change. So here's the best way I can actually explain this. So I suffer from migraines with visual auras. I have tracked it back down to actually vitamin A and taking too much of it, so I don't take multivitamins anymore. So it's rare that I get them now, but when I do, it's because I wasn't paying attention. Anyhow, when I do get them, it starts as a blind spot in the center of my vision. However, it's not a traditional blind spot. It's not just a hit of blackness, but it's just essentially missing information. Like if I'm looking at a book and I'm reading, the center will be blind, but the image is still there. Like I can still see the paper, I just can't see the words. And that's because I can't discern the information. It's really interesting what my brain is doing despite no actual visual information coming in at the moment. My brain is putting what it thinks is there rather than what I'm actually seeing. So because of that, I can see what's there based on patterns, but what's actually there isn't seen by me. And if this sounds absolutely crazy, just remember our vision is actually flipped. Our brain just fixes it. So technically you see everything upside down. Your brain is actually just correcting that vision. Then as the migraine progresses, the spot in the middle will spread out until it becomes like a target, and I can see in the middle, but around that ring I can no longer see until it spreads past my field of vision and then just turns into a headache, which kind of sucks. Basically, despite my neurons not firing or receiving information, I'm sure they're firing, they're just in a subdued state, this will still tell me that something is there as my brain fills in the missing pieces. And this is exactly what the mold spore is doing. By subduing the neurons in the occipital lobe, he can still see, but his vision is much more susceptible to filling in the missing pieces. Here, with the memories being activated and the auditory hallucinations setting in through stimulation, his brain perceives to see Mia at the beginning. The fetus monster later is which his amygdala is probably being stimulated and associated with likely the birth of his daughter, making him fearful, and then seeing the doll he saw earlier being associated with Donna. Because what he's seeing is purely a hallucination brought on by stimulation of some portions of the brain and subduing of others, all based on blocking the reuptake of serotonin in the occipital visual cortex and forced firing of neurons within the temporal lobe and hippocampus. Ultimately, this encounter would lead to Donna's end, however. Again, I think a case could be made that really all of them are operating outside their normal minds due to their infection by the cadou and Mother Miranda's influence. But with Donna having lived the life she did, really was more of a mercy thing pulling her out of that. But then again, I think you should know, cutting apart younglings with the explicit purpose of cramming another consciousness into their brain case probably isn't the side you want to go with. All I can think of is that meme that's like, wait, are we the bad guys?